The sound of the train's whistle echoed through the air as Eliza Kowalski stepped off the dusty platform. She had never seen anything like this before. The dry land, the endless sky, the mountains in the distance. It was nothing like the crowded streets of Warsaw, where she had grown up. She was alone now, after losing her husband to illness and her family scattered across Europe. But in America, she believed she could make a fresh start. She clutched the worn leather handle of her suitcase, the only possession she had left. Her heart pounded with both excitement and fear as she took her first steps on the land of opportunity. But when the station master noticed her, that excitement quickly began to fade. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, his lip curling in disdain. He was used to seeing all kinds of people, but there was something about Eliza that made him uneasy. Maybe it was her thick Polish accent, or the way her hands trembled as she tried to speak. Either way, he wasn't kind. "You got here just fine," he said gruffly. "But if you can't speak proper English, you'll never last. Go back home, where you came from, if you can't be understood here." The sting of his words hit Eliza like a slap. She knew her English wasn't perfect, but she had tried her best. She didn't expect to be accepted with open arms. She only wanted a chance. She didn't respond to him. She only nodded and hurried away from the station, away from his mocking eyes, towards the town's general store. Maybe here she'd find some kindness. But when she reached the store, things didn't get better. The shopkeeper, a stout woman with a harsh gaze, turned her the moment she stepped through the door. "We don't serve your kind here," she said without hesitation. "Go on, take your business somewhere else." Her voice was cold, unwelcoming. Eliza's hands trembled as she fumbled for the few coins in her pocket. She had hoped to buy some bread, maybe a small gift for the man who had agreed to let her stay on his ranch. But there was no room for a stranger here, not even someone with the best of intentions. As she walked out, the feeling of isolation deepened. The world around her felt like it was rejecting her at every turn. She had no family, no friends, no one to turn to. All she had was a promise from a man she'd never met, James Garrett, the owner of a ranch just outside of town. She had written to him months ago in search of a fresh start. He had answered her letter with the offer of work. No marriage proposal, no promises beyond that. But the fact that someone had agreed to take her in, even if it was only for work, had been a lifeline in her darkest hours. As she made her way towards Garrett's ranch, her feet felt heavier with each step. She had never been to this part of the country before, and a vast, empty plain stretched out before her like an unending sea. Her heart quickened as she approached the large wooden gate at the edge of the property, where two horses grazed in the field beyond. A man appeared from behind the barn, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. She recognized him immediately, James Garrett. He had the rugged look of someone who had spent his whole life working the land, his face weathered by the sun. He was everything she had imagined. But as she took a step forward, his brother, Robert, came into view. He had a look of disdain on his face as he sized her up, his eyes darting from her to the suitcase at her feet. "Who's this?" Robert asked, his voice sharp. "What do you want, girl?" Eliza swallowed hard, trying to gather her words. I come to work," she said, her accent thick, the words tangled in her mouth. "I can help. I work hard. I'll learn more English." "Please," Robert scoffed and took a step back, crossing his arms. "You come all the way from Poland to work on a ranch, and you can't even speak right. You'll never fit in here." But James didn't say anything at first. He was still at the far end of the field, working with a horse. He didn't seem to notice his brother's cruelty, or if he did, he didn't react. Eliza's heart sank, and she started to turn away, thinking that even James, the man who had invited her, would think her voice was as ugly as Robert did. But then, something unexpected happened. James walked over, his footsteps heavy on the dry earth, and stood beside his brother. For a moment, he just looked at Eliza, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he picked up her suitcase and held it out to her. "Stay," he said simply, his voice low and steady. Eliza blinked, confused. Was he rejecting her or offering something else? Before she could ask, Robert stepped forward, his voice laced with anger. "You're making a mistake, James. The whole valley will hear about this by morning. You'll regret this." James didn't respond to him. He simply turned and began walking toward the house, Eliza following behind. The weight of Robert's words hung in the air, and Eliza couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Would the townspeople accept her, or would she be driven out of yet another place she had hoped could be home? The answer would come soon enough, but for now, all she could do was follow James, her heart full of uncertainty. Inside James Garrett's house, the silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Eliza stepped in hesitantly, her eyes darting around the sparsely furnished room. It wasn't much. No carpets, no pictures on the walls, just the bare necessities. A few pieces of old furniture and a stove in the corner were all that seemed to occupy the space. The house felt cold, not just from the absence of warmth, but from the lack of life. She had been expecting something simple, but this was different. It was empty, as if the house itself was waiting for something, for someone to breathe life into it. She stood there awkwardly for a moment, unsure of what to do. James, who had followed her in and placed her suitcase by the door, didn't offer any guidance. He just moved silently, like he was lost in his own thoughts. Eliza's English wasn't good enough to start conversation, and it was clear from the way he avoided eye contact that he wasn't eager to engage either. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them said a word. After a long pause, she decided to do something. She rolled up her sleeves and, without being asked, started sweeping the floor. It was the only thing she could think to do to show she could contribute. She didn't want to be a burden, especially not in this strange new place where no one seemed to want her. Her hands worked quickly, the broom sweeping away dust as the silence pressed in from all sides. Eventually, the sound of her sweeping was joined by the soft clink of metal as she pulled ingredients from the cabinet to make a simple meal. It wasn't much, some potatoes, carrots, and a little salt, but it was the best she could do with what she had. As she worked, she glanced occasionally at James, who had settled by the window, his gaze lost in the vast, open space beyond. She wondered if he was thinking about the same thing she was, her accent, her broken English, the fact that she was a stranger in his house. She tried to imagine what it would be like to live here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but land and silence. She wondered if he had ever been lonely. Eliza finished cooking and set the table quietly, then sat down across from James. He didn't look at her as she placed a small bowl of food in front of him. He only stared out the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the table in a rhythmic pattern. It was as though he was in another world altogether. Eliza watched him for a moment, then decided to break the silence, even if she didn't know the right words. She looked at him and, in the simplest way she could, said, "Thank you, James, for letting me stay." Her English was thick, clumsy, but she meant it with every part of her. Her heart ached with the weight of all the things she couldn't say. James didn't respond at first, his eyes never leaving the window. But then, after a long pause, he spoke softly, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used much lately. "No need to thank me. You've got your work here. That's enough." His words were simple, and the way he said them made her feel like an outsider, but she understood. This was not a place for kindness, not a place for warmth. It was a place where hard work was all that mattered. She tried to push the feeling away and focused on her meal instead. The food was simple, nothing like the feast she used to have back home, but it was warm and it filled the empty space in her stomach. As they ate, the silence between them deepened. Eliza felt the loneliness settle around her like a heavy cloak. She didn't know how to make herself understood, didn't know how to break through the walls that James had built around himself. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, and she wondered if he even wanted her here. But then, as she finished eating, she glanced at him and saw something that made her pause. His face, usually hardened and unreadable, softened for a brief moment as he stared at something in the corner of the room. It was a small, dusty toy, a child's doll, its worn face faded with age. The sight of it made something in James's expression flicker, and Eliza recognized it instantly. Pain. The toy was the only thing in the room that seemed out of place, the only thing that seemed to speak of life once lived. Her heart twisted with sympathy, and she looked away quickly, not wanting to intrude on his grief. But she couldn't ignore the sadness that seemed to hang over him like a shadow. She had lost so much herself, but there was something about James's loss that felt deeper, more permanent. She wondered if it was the reason he didn't speak much, why he seemed so closed off. He wasn't just a man living in silence. He was a man who had been hurt, who had lost something that could never be replaced. As the night wore on, Eliza cleaned up the dishes and retired to the small guest room. She hadn't expected comfort, but the bed was hard and the room was cold. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, thinking about the day. The isolation was overwhelming, and she couldn't help but feel homesick. Her eyes burned as the weight of everything pressed down on her chest. She tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway, soft and silent. She missed her family, missed the life she had known. She missed the sounds of her native language, the warmth of her home, the comfort of knowing she belonged somewhere. She couldn't even speak properly here. She was nothing but a foreigner, an outsider. Her tears soaked the pillow, but she didn't make a sound. She wasn't sure if anyone would even care if she did. But then, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard something, a faint sound coming from the hall. She froze, straining to listen. It was a soft humming, a lullaby, a melody she recognized, one that had been sung to her when she was a child. It was James. She didn't know why he was humming, but it felt like a bridge between them, a silent acknowledgement of the hurt they both carried. She closed her eyes, letting the soft melody wash over her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. There was still hope. Tomorrow, maybe things would be different. The morning was cold and still, with a thin mist hanging in the air as Eliza worked at the chicken coop, feeding the birds and tending to the animals with quiet diligence. She had risen early, as she always did, and though her English was still broken, her heart was set on proving that she could contribute. The simple task of caring for the animals brought her a small sense of comfort, a connection to the land that felt familiar in the midst of so much unfamiliarity. As she worked, she heard the sound of horses approaching, their hooves beating against the dirt road. Her heart sank. She knew who it was before they even reached the ranch. The delegation from town was coming. Mrs. Dorothy Chun, the town matriarch, was at the front, followed by Pastor Whitfield and Robert, her ever-present ally. Eliza's stomach twisted with nerves as they pulled up to the gate. They had come to deliver their judgment, to declare whether or not she was worthy of being allowed to stay in their town, of being allowed to marry James Garrett. The delegation dismounted from their horses, their faces stern and unyielding. Mrs. Chun, with her silver hair and sharp eyes, walked straight toward the house, not sparing Eliza a glance. Robert, ever the cruel one, followed behind, his eyes filled with disdain. Pastor Whitfield, a tall man with a somber expression, lagged behind them, his posture stiff. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. She couldn't run, not anymore. She had no place to go, and she wasn't sure if she even wanted to run. She wanted to belong here, even if it meant enduring their judgment. The delegation entered the house without a word, their footsteps echoing in the silent space. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching as they filed in. Robert's eyes roamed the room, taking in every detail with a critical eye, while Mrs. Chun, as always, seemed to have the air of someone who had already decided the fate of those around her. Pastor Whitfield lingered at the back, his face troubled, as though he knew he was being forced to choose a side. Eliza didn't need to be told what this was. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Mrs. Chun spoke first, her voice cold and authoritative. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her gaze sweeping over Eliza with barely disguised contempt, "we must discuss this situation." James stood by the window, his back turned to them, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was firm. "There's nothing to discuss, Mrs. Chun," he said. "Eliza stays. We've made arrangements. She's working here and will marry." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Chun, clearly taken aback by the ease with which James spoke, pressed on. "You don't understand the implications of this, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice filled with a mix of pity and condescension. "The town will never accept this. We cannot stand by and allow someone who can barely speak English, who doesn't even understand our ways, to be a part of this community. She's an outsider. She can't be trusted to uphold our values." Eliza's face burned with shame at her words. She tried to hide her hurt, but it was impossible. She wasn't a part of their world, and no matter how hard she tried, they would never see her as one of them. But before she could speak, Robert stepped forward, his cruel laughter filling the room. "You see, she can't even string together a proper sentence. She's simple-minded, just like we thought. She's an embarrassment, James. Send her back on the evening train, and let's put this whole mistake behind us." Eliza's heart raced, her throat tightening as she tried to hold back the tears. She wasn't simple-minded. She was trying, and she was learning. But none of that mattered to them. To them, she was just a foreigner, a mistake that needed to be corrected. James, however, didn't flinch. He turned to face them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like the room was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the decision. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "She's staying. We'll marry on Saturday, proper, in front of everyone. That's final." The words were decisive, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Mrs. Chin's face reddened with anger, and Robert's eyes flashed with outrage. "You're making a mistake, James," Mrs. Chun said, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "The town will never accept you, and you'll be an outcast. No one will trade with you. No one will buy your cattle, and no one will come to your wedding. You'll be alone, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." James didn't respond. He simply turned his back to them and walked toward the door. Eliza stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether to feel relief or fear. The decision had been made, but the consequences were far from over. As the delegation filed out, Robert lingered by the door, his eyes narrowed in fury. "You've cursed this family," he spat at Eliza. "You'll ruin everything." The door slammed behind them, and Eliza was left standing in the silence. James didn't turn around as he walked back toward her, but when he reached her, he handed her a small book. It was a faded, leather-bound volume, the pages yellowed with age. "My mother's English primer," he said quietly. "It'll help you. Wedding Saturday. Can you be ready?" Eliza held the book in her trembling hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if she could learn enough in time, if she could ever be enough to satisfy the town's expectations. But she couldn't back down now. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll try." James's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he nodded. "Good. We'll face them together." As the door closed behind him, Eliza stared down at the book, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Would she be ready? Could she prove herself in time? And would James still stand by her when the world came crashing down around them? The days leading up to the wedding were filled with uncertainty and an overwhelming sense of pressure, each passing hour a challenge to both Eliza and James. The house felt different now, as if the weight of the town's judgment had settled heavily within its walls. Eliza worked tirelessly, her mind focused on one thing, proving that she could belong. The English primer James had given her became her constant companion. Each night, she would sit by the dim oil lamp, her tired fingers tracing the words on the pages, her thick Polish accent stumbling over each syllable as she tried to learn the sounds of a language that still felt foreign to her. James was patient, guiding her through the lessons, pointing at objects around the house and teaching her their names: table, stove, horse, simple words that would eventually become the building blocks of a life she hoped to create here. There were moments of humor, too, like when she taught him the Polish word for stubborn, laughing as he tried to pronounce it with his rough American accent. She felt a small spark of connection in those moments, as if the walls between them were slowly beginning to crumble, even if only a little. But outside the house, the world remained cold and unwelcoming. The town, with its tight-knit community and deep-rooted prejudices, continued to make their disapproval known. Young boys would throw stones at her as she walked through town, and women would deliberately turn their backs, refusing to even acknowledge her presence. Eliza tried to ignore the harshness, but it wore on her. She returned to the house one afternoon with her dress torn, dirt streaked across her face, and tears in her eyes. It felt like the entire town was bent on breaking her spirit, on forcing her to leave, to prove that she didn't belong. But James, though quiet as ever, was not blind to the cruelty she faced. He didn't speak much about it, but the next day, something shifted. Eliza was out tending to the chickens when she noticed that the families who had thrown stones at her were no longer able to purchase goods from the local feed store. The store clerk had told her in hushed tones that James had quietly revoked their credit, using his leverage to make them pay for their behavior. It was a small victory, but it gave Eliza a sense of hope. James might not have spoken much, but his actions spoke louder than words. On the second day, Eliza found herself facing a new challenge. She had no wedding dress. Her old clothes, which she had managed to bring with her from Poland, were too worn to serve any purpose for the ceremony. She took to the idea of making her own, trying to stitch together a dress from old curtains she had found in the attic. It was a ridiculous failure, the fabric too stiff and the stitching uneven. She sighed in frustration, the hopelessness of the situation creeping in again. But James, ever silent and enigmatic, disappeared for a few hours, only to return with something that took Eliza's breath away: his mother's preserved wedding dress. It was old, delicate, but in surprisingly good condition. "Your mother's?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling as she touched the fabric. James nodded without a word. "She'd want someone kind to wear it," he said softly, his usual reserve giving way to a rare, vulnerable moment. Eliza's heart swelled with emotion as she gently held the dress up to her body, seeing herself in it for the first time. It didn't fit perfectly, the seams straining a little at her shoulders, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She felt beautiful in a way she hadn't before. She wasn't just a foreigner. She wasn't just a woman with an accent. She was a woman being accepted, being chosen, and that was more than she had ever hoped for. But even as she prepared for the wedding, the threat from the town loomed over her. Mrs. Chun and her followers hadn't given up, and as the day drew closer, the pressure only grew. It was the third day, the final day before the wedding, when a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, and the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls of the house. Eliza and James were forced to stay inside together, the storm a powerful reminder that the world outside was not on their side. The storm became a symbol, a metaphor for the turbulence that both of them were facing. In the isolation of the house, with the rain pouring down outside, they were forced to confront their deepest fears. It was then that their most honest conversation took place. Eliza, her voice quiet and hesitant, spoke of her own losses, the baby she had lost back in Poland, the family she had left behind. "People twist my words because of how I speak," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But inside, she tapped her chest. Inside, words are clear. James looked at her then, his expression softening for the first time in days. "I hear them," he said quietly. "The clear ones." For the first time, Eliza understood that he was not a man who would judge her by her accent, by her broken English. He was a man who heard her heart, who saw the woman behind the words. It was a small but powerful moment, one that felt like a turning point for both of them. But even as they shared this connection, the weight of what was to come hung over them. The town's rejection was still a shadow that loomed large, and Eliza couldn't shake the fear that it might tear them apart. As the storm raged outside, they stood on the brink of something they both wanted but were too afraid to fully grasp. In the quiet that followed, the closeness between them grew, and for the first time since her arrival, Eliza felt a deep sense of peace. Tomorrow would be the wedding, and she didn't know what the town would do, but in that moment, she was no longer afraid of facing it alone. With James by her side, she felt a courage she had never known. The storm outside raged on, but in the heart of the house, there was something new, something stronger than fear, something that gave her hope. The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation, a quiet stillness that filled the house as Eliza stood before the mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the wedding dress. It was too big, the seams straining at the shoulders, but it didn't matter. She was no longer the scared, broken woman who had arrived just days ago. She had a voice now, a purpose, and a future that was being shaped in this small, remote corner of the world. She stood tall, practicing her English phrases in the mirror. I do. I do. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but they were more than just words. They were a promise, a vow to herself, to James, and to the life they were about to begin. Despite the fear that still lingered, Eliza felt a quiet strength rising within her. But even as she stood there, making her preparations, she knew that not everyone shared her hope. The town had not forgotten about her, and Mrs. Chun, with her sharp eyes and harsh words, had made it clear that she would not let Eliza's marriage pass without interference. As the hour drew closer, Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her, and every step toward the church felt like a step into the unknown. When she stepped outside, the air was thick with tension. The small crowd of townspeople that had gathered near the church was a stark reminder of the rejection she had faced. Most of them had boycotted the wedding, refusing to show up, and their absence was as loud as their presence would have been. The few who did come, faces tight with disapproval, watched her with a coldness that cut through her like a blade. Robert stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes filled with contempt. He had made it clear that he would never accept this union, that he would never accept her. The church was small, and as Eliza entered, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, judging her, whispering behind her back. Her heart beat faster, and the silence in the church felt like a physical weight. She had always imagined her wedding day to be one of joy, but today, it felt like a trial. Pastor Whitfield, standing at the altar, looked uncomfortable as he prepared to marry them, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the prayer book. The ceremony started, but Eliza could feel the unease in the air. The words of the pastor seemed rushed, as though he, too, was trying to get through the ceremony as quickly as possible. She tried to focus on James, standing next to her, his presence steady and calm, but even he seemed tense, his jaw clenched. Just as the vows were about to be exchanged, the doors to the church burst open with a loud bang. Eliza's heart skipped a beat as Mrs. Chun stormed in, her face red with fury. I must object. Mrs. Chin's voice rang out, sharp and unforgiving. The room fell into stunned silence, all eyes turning toward the woman who had long been the voice of authority in the town. Her presence was like a shadow that threatened to swallow the light of the ceremony. Eliza could feel her hands trembling, her body growing cold. She had known this would happen, had known that Mrs. Chun wouldn't let her marry James without a fight, but the reality of it was still a shock. This woman cannot even speak properly, Mrs. Chun continued, her voice filled with contempt. How can she raise children? How can she teach them when she doesn't even understand our language? She is not fit to be a Christian wife. Her words cut through the air like a knife. each syllable heavy with judgment. Eliza felt the sting of every word, the weight of every gaze that turned on her. She had known this would happen. She had known they would never accept her, but hearing it, having it laid bare in front of everyone, made her heart feel like it was breaking. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Eliza could see the doubt in the eyes of the people she had hoped to call her neighbors. James stiffened beside her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might speak, might defend her, but then Eliza did something she had never thought she would do. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the judgment pressing down on her, and she stepped forward. "You are right," Eliza said, her voice shaking, but stronger than she had ever heard it before. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen, but they felt true in her heart. "My English is not good. I have an accent. Maybe always I have accent. But I know words for important things. I know love. I know kind. I know protect family. I know faith in God. Maybe I say them not perfect, but I mean them perfect." She paused, looking around at the people who had come to judge her, her eyes meeting Mrs. Chen's, then Robert's, then the others. "You think because I speak different, I'm not smart. But I learned 3 languages. How many you learn?" She could feel the heat in her cheeks, the weight of their judgment, but she did not step back. "You think because I'm foreign, I not understand American way. But I come here for same reason your grandparents come, for freedom, for hope, for better life." She felt her courage growing with each word. "James, he not care how I speak. He care what I say. He listen to my heart, not my accent." Her voice rose, becoming stronger, more sure. "You judge me for my voice. But who here has voice full of kindness instead of gossip? Who here speak with love instead of hate?" The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Pastor Whitfield shifted uncomfortably, and even Mrs. Chun seemed momentarily lost for words. Finally, it was the pastor who broke the silence. "The woman speaks truth, imperfect as it may sound," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. Mrs. Chen's face turned pale with fury, but she did not speak. One by one, the people who had come to oppose the marriage slowly turned their eyes away. Eliza could feel the shift, the quiet recognition that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong. The ceremony resumed, and James spoke his vows clearly, firmly, with a strength that had not been there before. Eliza, though her English was still imperfect, spoke hers as well, and in that moment, she felt more than just a wife. She felt like a woman who had finally found her voice. The words might have been simple, but they were hers, and that was all that mattered. As the ceremony continued, Eliza couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the town would think, and whether they would ever truly accept her. But for now, she had James, and that was enough. She had found the courage to stand, and with that courage, she knew she could face whatever came next. The air outside the church was thick with tension as Eliza stepped out with James, her heart still racing from the confrontation. The crowd of townspeople who had gathered earlier, their eyes cold and judgmental, now watched her with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The silence that had followed her speech in the church lingered, hanging over them like a cloud. She had spoken her truth, but would they hear it? Would they see beyond her accent, beyond her foreignness, and accept her for who she was? As Eliza stepped onto the church steps, she braced herself for the worst, expecting the whispers and stares to turn into mockery. But something unexpected happened. The first signs of a change came when a few children, the same ones who had thrown stones at her just days ago, hesitantly approached her. In their hands, they held wildflowers, their small faces unsure but hopeful. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she took the flowers from them, offering a soft, broken smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't know how to respond, but the simple gesture, the small but significant step toward kindness, made her heart swell. The children's mothers stood nearby, watching with a mixture of disbelief and begrudging respect. Mrs. Chun, who had led the charge against her from the start, stood at the back of the group, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Eliza noticed her, but she didn't let the woman's presence deter her. She focused instead on the kindness that had been offered to her, on the small victories that were slowly adding up. As she moved through the crowd, Eliza could feel a shift in the air. The coldness that had once surrounded her seemed to be melting, even if only a little. Some of the townspeople who had refused to acknowledge her before now nodded in her direction. The shopkeeper, who had once turned her away in disdain, tipped his hat to her as she passed. There was no grand display of approval, no sudden rush of acceptance, but there was something more important, a shift in how she was seen. The town was not ready to embrace her completely, but they were beginning to see her as more than just the foreign woman with the strange accent. There was respect in the air, and that was enough for now. As Eliza walked with James back toward the ranch, she felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Things were changing, but slowly. She didn't know if they would ever truly accept her, but she could feel a glimmer of hope in her heart. At least now, she wasn't the enemy. At least now, she had a place in this world, no matter how small. When they arrived at the ranch, there was a stillness in the air, a quietness that spoke of the challenges they had both faced. The house was theirs now, truly theirs, but it felt different. The sense of isolation that had once hung heavy in the air seemed to be lifting. Eliza could feel the weight of the day's events settling into her bones, and she was tired, more tired than she had ever been. But there was also something else, a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, however tentative. James, as quiet as ever, was standing on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. He looked over at Eliza as she approached, his face softened by a rare smile. It wasn't much, but it was everything. They stood together, side by side, watching the colors of the sky change as the day turned to night. There was no need for words between them. They both knew what had happened, what had been won and what had been lost. The storm that had raged inside her since she had arrived here was beginning to settle. For the first time, she could feel the land, the house, the world around her becoming a part of her. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. James didn't say anything at first, but when he did, his voice was low and gentle. "Some people will never accept you, Eliza," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But you matter to me. That's all that matters." Her heart swelled at his words, the warmth in his voice filling the spaces that had once felt cold and empty. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll do my best. I'll make this work." She didn't know what the future held, didn't know how the town would evolve or if they would ever fully accept her, but she knew one thing. With James by her side, she could face whatever came next. They had been through so much already, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it felt like it was theirs to walk together. The world around them was still changing, still uncertain, but in this moment, there was peace. The hardest battles had been fought, and for now, they were together. Eliza rested her head on James's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against hers as the sun sank lower in the sky. They stood there in silence, not needing to say anything more. It was enough to simply be. The future was unwritten, but for the first time since she had arrived, Eliza felt a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, the hardest part was behind them. The town might never fully embrace her, but she had found something more important, her place in this world beside the man she loved. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Eliza allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She had come a long way, and though the journey was far from over, she knew that she was no longer alone. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, one step at a time. And that, in itself, was enough. Months had passed since Eliza's wedding, and life on the ranch had begun to settle into a rhythm, though not without its challenges. The town, despite their quiet, grudging acceptance, had not fully embraced her. There were still whispers in the street, sideways glances, and occasionally an empty storefront when she walked by. But there was something else now, a sense of resolve that Eliza carried with her every day. She had proven herself in small ways that meant more to her than the approval of others. She worked hard, tending to the animals, helping James with the land, and most of all, continuing her studies of English. Her accent, while still thick, had softened in places, and her speech, though far from perfect, was now far clearer than when she first arrived. She had become a fixture of the ranch, her presence like the steady rhythm of the seasons that passed in the valley. But despite all the hard work, one shadow still loomed over their lives: the letter from the immigration office. It had come 2 weeks after the wedding, a terse, official notification that questioned the legitimacy of Eliza's marriage. The letter demanded that they prove their union was not one of convenience, threatening Eliza with deportation if they could not provide sufficient evidence of their love and commitment. It was a blow neither of them had expected. James had been furious when the letter arrived, crumpling it in his hands before he could read it all the way through. But Eliza had kept calm, understanding the gravity of the situation in a way James had not been able to grasp at first. She knew that her accent, her background, and the way people saw her would make this a difficult battle. She knew the odds were stacked against them, and yet, despite everything, she felt something she hadn't before: a quiet, unwavering determination. She wasn't going to let them take her away from the life she had built with James. And neither would he. The fight to stay in America, to remain married to James, had begun. The town, while reluctant to acknowledge it, was about to become a battleground. James took Eliza's hand one evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the vast Montana sky. "We'll fight this, Eliza," he said, his voice firm but laced with a trace of uncertainty. "If they want proof, we'll give it to them. We'll show them that what we have is real." Eliza nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering support. She had never imagined that someone like James, someone so quiet, so set in his ways, would stand up for her like this. It was one thing to marry her in defiance of the town's prejudices, but it was another to stand against an official government inquiry. The days that followed were filled with tension. Eliza spent hours in the house, preparing for what was to come. She reread the letters she had written to James, the ones that had brought her to him in the first place, and found comfort in the words that had started this journey. She remembered her first night at the ranch, how scared and alone she had felt, and how, despite everything, James had chosen her. She had chosen him, too, with all her heart. The fight to stay would require more than just love. It would require proof. It would require a community that could vouch for them, that could testify to the depth of their commitment. James and Eliza knew they would need the support of the town, even if it meant facing down the very people who had rejected her from the beginning. The town meeting was called by the immigration official, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Stevens, who had been assigned to investigate their marriage. He arrived with a small entourage of government clerks, his presence casting a long shadow over the small church that had once been a place of peace. The meeting was held in the town hall, and though only a few of the town's residents had agreed to show up, Eliza felt as though the entire town was there, watching her, waiting for her to fail. They were seated at a long wooden table, the tension palpable in the air. Mr. Stevens, who had the air of someone who had seen far too many cases like theirs, sat at the head of the table, a notebook in front of him. The townspeople were seated in rows behind him, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. The pastor, who had married them, was present, as was Mrs. Chun, who had never let go of her disdain for Eliza. It was clear that she was here to make sure Eliza didn't get away with her supposed trick of marrying into the Garrett family. "This is a formality," Mr. Stevens said, his voice cold and businesslike. "I'm here to determine whether or not this marriage is valid. If it's found to be a marriage of convenience, Mrs. Garrett will be deported. If not, she can stay. You will be asked to testify about the nature of your relationship. If there are inconsistencies or doubts, the case will be closed and Mrs. Garrett will have to leave. The words hung heavy in the air, but Eliza didn't flinch. She had been through too much to back down now. When her turn came to speak, Eliza rose from her seat, her hands trembling but her heart resolute. She was asked to recount the details of her life in Poland, of how she had come to America, of the letters she had exchanged with James. She spoke slowly, carefully, knowing that every word mattered. "I was alone," she said, her voice steady despite the eyes that watched her. "I had lost my husband, my family. I wrote to James because I had no one left. He answered my letter, and we agreed I would come to work. But when I arrived, I didn't just find a place to work. I found a man who heard me, who saw me for who I was, and not just for the accent I carried." She paused, her hands resting on the edge of the table as she faced the officials. "I know my English is not perfect," she continued, "but I am learning. I know my accent is thick, but that does not make my love for James any less true. I am not here for any other reason than because I love him. He loves me." There was a moment of silence after her words. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, some skeptical, others unwilling to let go of their prejudices. But then Pastor Whitfield stood, his face somber but resolute. "I have known James for years," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I have seen the way he looks at Eliza. I've seen the way he cares for her. This is not a marriage of convenience. It is a marriage built on love, no matter how it may seem to the outside world." Mrs. Chun stood next, her face flushed with anger. "I don't believe it," she spat, her voice harsh. "You can't possibly tell me that this is real. She doesn't even speak our language properly. How can you say it's real?" But her voice faltered as the townspeople began to murmur among themselves. Slowly, one by one, people who had once rejected Eliza began to speak up. The shopkeeper who had once refused her service, the young mother whose children had thrown stones at her. Each one stood, offering a small piece of testimony, a moment of recognition for the woman they had once looked down upon. It was a slow, hesitant shift, but it was enough. When the official deliberations began, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Eliza sat beside James, her hand in his, waiting for the final word. The minutes felt like hours, the tension building with every second. Finally, Mr. Stevens cleared his throat and looked up from his notes. "After considering the testimonies and the evidence presented, I find that this marriage is genuine," he said, his voice firm. "Mrs. Garrett may remain in the United States." The relief that washed over Eliza was overwhelming. She turned to James, her eyes filled with tears, and he held her close, their embrace a quiet celebration of everything they had fought for. The town had seen them, really seen them, and in the end, love had proven itself to be stronger than any prejudice. The following months were quieter, as if a new chapter had begun. Eliza's English improved with every passing day, and as her language grew stronger, so did her connection to the community. She began teaching English to the other immigrant women in town, helping them find their voices just as she had. It wasn't easy, but it was a start, and as she taught them, she learned even more about herself and the people around her. The letter that had once threatened to tear them apart now felt like a distant memory. Life on the ranch was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of morning chores and the warmth of shared moments. One afternoon, as Eliza stood in the general store, buying fabric for a new project, she was greeted by the shopkeeper, who now smiled warmly at her. "Afternoon, Mrs. Garrett," he said, tipping his hat. "What can I get for you today?" Eliza smiled back, her heart light. "Just some fabric for baby clothes," she said, her accent still thick, but no longer a barrier to connection. She had found her place. She had found her home. As she stepped outside, James was waiting for her, his hand resting on his belly as he felt the baby kick. They had a future now, a family, a life built on love and resilience. And as they walked back to the ranch, Eliza knew that no matter what came next, she was home. James loved her, and she loved him, and that was all that mattered. Together, they had faced the world's judgment and emerged stronger. And as they looked out over the land they had built together, Eliza knew that her story, was just beginning. The world might have tried to silence her, but she had found her voice. And that voice would carry her through the rest of her life.